Hello, welcome. My name is Robert Remmerswaal. I am a professor in Japan at Soju University and a PhD student at the Prefectural University of Kumamoto. Today, we're going to go through a repeated short virtual exchanges effect on communication confidence. First of all, what's a virtual exchange? You can see here a long definition. More or less, it's students who are in a course engaging with other students in a course who are geographically separated, so in another country, and who speak another language. Now, there are many types or models of virtual exchange. Today, what we're looking at is the common language model. So, this one focuses on communication practice more so than intercultural communication competence, which you might see in other models above. And of course, it's in lingua franca. So, it's just about speaking with students who are also studying English together and practicing your English. So, in a previous common language model, virtual exchange, we saw 400 students in Japan and Korea sending videos to each other, sending comments back and forth, and they had a chance to speak for 5+ minutes together. This increased their self-efficacy, their communication competence, and decreased their communication anxiety. In this study, 15 students who were alongside that study and also had a chance to be in the pilot study, which led to them being excluded from that previous study, are being examined. So they did 4 different surveys in the same format both times. Today we're focusing on 2 aspects of that survey, so self-perceived communication competence and communication anxiety. Together that makes communication confidence. And you can see exactly what they were asked, how competent they would feel or anxious they would feel in the following situations. We're going to interpret the results from those surveys using t-tests, which looks at averages, convergence, which looks at those individual changes and the trends across that, and interpret it through social cognitive theory, which Bandura put forth in his 1997 book. So, very quickly, in virtual exchange 1, these students had very similar results to the overall results of the largest study mentioned earlier with over 400 students. So even though there's only 15 students today, at least at the beginning, they have the same trends. So their perceived communication competence went up and their anxiety went down. Now, they had a little break, so post-virtual exchange 1, pre-virtual exchange 2, most of these areas decreased other than small group and acquaintance. Interesting enough, the virtual exchange, speaking in small groups with acquaintances. The decrease overall makes sense. It was 3.5 months without communicating with international peers. And here's a convergence analysis. So convergence looks at each individual. The x-axis shows where they started and the y-axis shows where they changed. A positive y value is an increase and a negative y value is a decrease. Some students stayed the same, but those who began with very confident lost confidence, and those who began with low confidence gained confidence. In communication anxiety here, we can see that it decreased in most areas, despite the fact that they had 3.5-month gap. And this included a summer vacation where they admitted to me they had not practiced their English at all. But if we look at convergence in those individuals, the very anxious students became much less anxious during these few months, and some became more anxious. So this type of convergence is considered beta convergence, and many students said that the virtual exchange, that first one, was their first opportunity to interact with foreign peers. So their anxiety ideas beforehand were just that, ideas, not based on experience. So let's look pre-virtual exchange 1 all the way to the end of virtual exchange 2. We can see that there are no meaningful changes, right? Where they started is kind of where they ended. The initial increases were lost over the summer break. They didn't recover after a second exchange. Now, Bandura writes that emotional states can affect opinions of ability, and likely that is what happened post-virtual exchange 1. So those increases we saw, emotionally charged responses perhaps, and then post-virtual exchange 2, they may have felt accomplished again, so they could have had those emotions, but now they have more experience on which to base those opinions. But it's more nuanced than that. Let's look at those individuals. Likely that previous interpretation works for students near a y value of 0, but we see students with large decreases and others with increases, and likely those students now have a better understanding of their communication competence, as these students all had very similar competence as I observed in the classroom. And if we looked at communication anxiety again, beginning to the end, we see that it keeps going down and down and down. So this makes sense when many of the students said it's their first time speaking with foreign peers. So for it to decrease further after a second time is very encouraging about the benefits of such a virtual exchange. So in social cognitive theory, this can be explained as students likely felt successful and were able to communicate more successfully than they had imagined. Emotional responses in post-virtual exchange 1 are possible, but very unlikely in pre-virtual exchange 2, where they saw another decrease. And the further decrease post-virtual exchange 2 is now based on actual experiences and not just what they thought their anxiety levels would be. So this type of interpretation would apply to students with a negative y value, those whose anxiety decreased, but actually for many, unfortunately, there were slight increases in anxiety. This is where convergence gives that nuanced interpretation, and once again, it's likely that students are becoming more aware of their anxiety and what they felt rather than what they thought they might feel. So if we're looking at the t-test and averages, SBC didn't change, too bad. Communication anxiety did decrease over time, that's very good, but it's very nuanced as to who increased and who decreased and why. It's not so cut and dry, and there's a few references here, and if you follow me on ResearchGate or ResearchMap, this will be published later this year, so you can see more of that nuance, get more of the interpretation, more of the references, and yeah, thank you so much for listening, and I hope to watch your presentations as well.